Why is it that some people pray, labor, try, hope, and still feel as though something invisible keeps resisting their progress? Why does it seem that for certain lives, breakthrough is always almost here, peace is always almost stable, favor is always almost within reach, and yet something interrupts the outcome at the final moment? And what if the deepest issue is not simply effort, timing, or even opposition from visible people, but a pattern of resistance that keeps reappearing in different forms? This is where spiritual life becomes serious, because there comes a point when a believer must stop treating repeated problems as isolated events and begin asking whether there is a deeper pattern underneath them. Not every delay is just delay. Not every failure is just a bad decision. Not every closed door is merely unfortunate timing. Some things repeat too intelligently to be dismissed casually. Some battles return too strategically to be called random. Some afflictions seem to know the exact point where they can do the most damage. And when you begin to see that, you realize that shallow responses will not be enough. Many people are exhausted not because they have done nothing, but because they have been applying the wrong response to a deeper problem. They are using effort where discernment is needed. They are using wishful language where authority is needed. They are using emotion where strategy is needed. They are treating symptoms while roots remain untouched. And whenever roots remain untouched, patterns return. The face may change, the season may change, the people involved may change, but the result keeps repeating itself. This is one of the most painful forms of spiritual frustration. It is not the pain of ignorance alone. It is the pain of trying hard and still seeing the same cycle. It is the sorrow of movement without arrival, of labor without visible fruit, of prayer without clear result, of watching other lives seem to move naturally while yours keeps encountering invisible resistance. And after a while, many people begin to normalize what should have been challenged. They adjust to limitation. They lower expectation. They make peace with what God never told them to accept. But Scripture never teaches believers to become passive in the face of entrenched resistance. It teaches us to discern. It teaches us to stand. It teaches us to wrestle, resist, and refuse agreement with darkness. That matters. Because some patterns remain active partly because they have never been directly confronted, they have been tolerated, adapted to, explained away, or spiritualized with shallow language. Yet there are moments when the soul must say, this must not continue. Not next month, not next year, not in another generation, not in another child, not in another season of my life. There must be a line drawn in the spirit where what has repeated too long is finally brought under the authority of Christ. That is where this kind of teaching begins. Not with drama, not with noise for its own sake, but with recognition. Recognition that there are powers, patterns, and pressures that do not yield merely because we notice them. Recognition that some battles must be confronted with seriousness. Recognition that vague spirituality cannot solve deliberate resistance. Recognition that if something has been targeting your peace, your progress, your prosperity, your health, your confidence, your calling, or your future, then your response must move beyond casual prayer into intentional spiritual engagement. Now we must be careful. This is not a call to exaggeration. Not every inconvenience is a demonic conspiracy. Not every struggle is mystical. Not every hardship is proof of hidden warfare. But the opposite error is just as dangerous. To reduce everything to psychology, luck, or circumstance, even when the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Wisdom is not found in overreaction or denial. It is found in truthful discernment. It asks, what exactly is happening here? What keeps repeating? What keeps being interrupted? What keeps leaking away? What seems to fall apart at the same stage? What force appears to be feeding this cycle? These questions matter because they lead you out of confusion and into spiritual diagnosis. And diagnosis always changes response Once you begin to understand that your issue may not just be isolated disappointment but a recurring pattern, you stop talking about it casually. Once you realize that what has been following your life is not a single event but a structure of resistance, you begin to respond with more seriousness. Once you understand that not all failures are equal, that not all delays are innocent, and that not all opposition is visible, then prayer takes on a different tone. It becomes more exact, more deliberate, more focused. This is why the believer must become spiritually awake enough to notice what has become familiar, awake enough to question what everyone else may call normal, awake enough to say that just because something has happened for years does not mean it has the right to continue. Familiarity is one of the most dangerous things in spiritual life. If sorrow repeats long enough, people begin to wear it like identity. If disappointment happens often enough, people begin to call it wisdom. If delay lasts long enough, people begin to call it destiny. But repetition does not equal permission. Longevity does not equal legitimacy. Just because something has stayed does not mean it belongs. And this is why internal posture matters so much. Before confrontation begins externally, something must settle internally. You must stop negotiating with what needs to be challenged. You must stop adjusting to what has been wasting your strength. You must stop speaking about serious matters as if they are minor inconveniences. You must become willing to be honest before God about what you are tired of, what you have tolerated, what you do not fully understand, and what must now be brought into the light. Because the truth is that many believers are not defeated by lack of desire. They are defeated by scattered engagement. They pray but without focus. They resist but without continuity. They cry out but without strategy. Their hearts are sincere but their responses are inconsistent. And inconsistency cannot overthrow a pattern that has been sustained over time. If a battle has been recurring in cycles, then the response must be stronger than a momentary burst of emotion. It must involve clarity, alignment, persistence, and spiritual seriousness. This is where the soul begins to understand the need for what could be called non-negotiable prayer. Not prayer as ritual, not prayer as performance, but prayer as engagement. Prayer that says, I am no longer merely describing the problem. I am confronting what empowers it. I am no longer just surviving what has been draining me. I am bringing it under the authority of Jesus Christ. I am no longer allowing my life to be shaped by repeated interruption, unexplained leakage, inherited weakness, or invisible sabotage. I am going to stand up in the truth of God and address what has been hiding behind the surface. And once that posture forms, something changes. Maybe not instantly in the visible realm, but deeply in the spirit of the person praying. They stop sounding defeated. They stop relating to their problem like a victim. They stop talking as though the cycle has permanent rights over them. They begin to recover moral and spiritual clarity. They begin to stand. They begin to see that while opposition may be real, so is divine authority. While patterns may be deep, so is the power of God. While the enemy may have worked with consistency, the truth of Christ is stronger than repetition. So this first part is a summons to wakefulness, a summons to seriousness, a summons to spiritual honesty, a summons to stop calling repeated bondage normal, a summons to stop reducing deep resistance to shallow language, a summons to recognize that some things in your life must now be directly addressed, not later, not eventually, but now. Because once the believer truly sees the pattern, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do these forces maintain their hold? And why do some problems seem to return even after seasons of relief? If something has been repeating in your life, the next question is not just what is happening, but how is it being sustained? Because patterns do not continue by accident. They continue because something is feeding them, reinforcing them, or leaving them unchallenged. And this is where many people miss it. They fight the visible result, but ignore the invisible structure that supports it. They pray against the outcome, but never address the system behind the outcome. They rebuke the moment, but never confront the pattern. So the same thing returns again, sometimes in a different form, but with the same effect. This is why spiritual discernment matters deeply, because not every battle is on the surface. Some battles are sustained through subtle openings, things that don't look dangerous at first, but over time create access points for repeated interference. For example, there are lives where progress starts strong, but something always interrupts it halfway. There are people who can begin well, but cannot finish well. There are others who can gather, but cannot keep. Some can receive opportunities, but cannot sustain them. Others can build relationships, but cannot maintain them. And if you look closely, you will see a pattern, not just an event. Now listen carefully. Anything that repeats in cycles must be questioned, because cycles are rarely random. Cycles suggest structure, and structure suggests something has been allowed, inherited, reinforced, or left unchallenged over time. This is why Scripture constantly calls believers to vigilance, not fear but awareness. Because what you do not confront consciously, you may end up sustaining unconsciously. Some patterns are sustained through agreement. Not always intentional agreement, but repeated language, repeated expectation, repeated inner belief. If a person keeps saying, "Things never work for me," over time, that statement stops being emotion and starts becoming alignment. Not because words are magic, but because words shape expectation. And expectation shapes posture, and posture influences response. Eventually, the person begins to live in a way that matches what they have accepted internally. Other patterns are sustained through passivity. When something happens repeatedly and is never challenged with clarity, the mind begins to normalize it. Once it is normalized, resistance weakens. Once resistance weakens, the pattern deepens. And before long, what should have been confronted early becomes something that feels permanent. There are also patterns that are sustained through inherited tendencies. Not everything that affects a person started with them. Some struggles are not just personal, they are generational patterns of behavior, thinking, or even spiritual negligence. This does not mean a person is doomed, but it does mean awareness is required, because what is not examined is often repeated. This is why you sometimes see the same kind of failure move through generations, not because God designed it that way, but because it was never interrupted. And interruption requires intentionality. It requires someone to stand up and say, "This stops here," not emotionally, but spiritually. Not casually, but consciously. Not once, but persistently. There are also patterns sustained through spiritual leakage. This is one of the most overlooked realities. A person can be receiving, but also losing. They can be progressing, but also leaking. Strength, focus, discipline, or clarity. So even though something is coming in, something else is draining out at the same time. And because of that, the overall life does not move forward the way it should. This is why some people pray, fast, and even experience moments of breakthrough, but the results don't stay. Not because nothing happened, but because something was not sealed, something was not guarded, something was not maintained, and so what came in could not remain. This is a hard truth, but an important one. Breakthrough is not just about receiving, it is also about sustaining. And sustaining requires awareness, discipline, and alignment. Now here is where it becomes deeper. Some patterns are sustained because they have never been directly confronted with authority. They have been discussed, complained about, even prayed about in a general sense, but never specifically addressed. And there is a difference. General prayer brings comfort. Specific engagement brings change. If someone keeps saying, "God help me," that is sincere, but it is not the same as identifying the exact pattern and confronting it with clarity. Because clarity focuses engagement, and focused engagement produces stronger results. This is why vague spirituality often leads to vague outcomes. But when a believer becomes specific, when they begin to identify patterns, name them, and bring them before God with intentionality, something begins to shift, not because of noise, but because of alignment. Now understand this clearly. This is not about fear. It is not about seeing darkness everywhere. It is about refusing to ignore what is clearly repeating. It is about refusing to normalize what is clearly destructive. It is about refusing to allow cycles to continue unchallenged. Because the longer something repeats, the more it tries to define your reality. And if you are not careful, you will begin to build your identity around your struggle instead of your calling. You will begin to expect limitation instead of breakthrough. You will begin to prepare for disappointment instead of growth. And once expectation shifts in the wrong direction, life begins to follow that expectation. That is why this moment matters. Because awareness creates a turning point. Once you see clearly, you cannot pretend not to see. Once you recognize the pattern, you cannot treat it casually anymore. Once you understand that something deeper has been at work, you cannot continue responding at the same level. Something has to change. Your posture has to change. Your language has to change. Your consistency has to change. Your engagement has to become more deliberate. Because cycles are not broken by accident. They are broken by confrontation, alignment, and persistence. And this leads to the next question. If these patterns are real, if they are sustained through structures, agreements, and unchallenged cycles, then how does a believer begin to actively break them instead of just managing them? Before anything can truly break in the visible realm, something must first break in the invisible structure that has been holding it in place. This is where many people misunderstand spiritual progress. They expect immediate outward change, but ignore the inward and unseen shifts that must happen first. Because real transformation does not begin with what you see. It begins with what is disconnected, overturned, and realigned beneath the surface. And this is exactly where authority comes in. Not noise, not emotion, authority. There is a difference between praying about something and addressing it with authority. One speaks from desire, the other speaks from position. And many believers stay in desire for too long without stepping into position. They ask, they hope, they wish, but they never stand. They never reach a point where something inside them becomes settled and says, this has gone on long enough. Because when that moment comes, prayer changes. It becomes more focused, more grounded, more direct. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer uncertain. You are no longer negotiating with the problem. You are no longer speaking as someone begging for relief. You are speaking as someone aligning with truth and confronting what contradicts it. This is what it means to engage spiritually. It means you stop treating resistance as something mysterious and untouchable. You begin to bring it into the light of truth. You begin to declare what is consistent with God's will and reject what is not. And this is where many patterns begin to weaken, because patterns survive in confusion, passivity, and inconsistency. But they begin to collapse under clarity, authority, and persistence. Now listen carefully. Authority is not shouting louder. Authority is standing on what is true consistently. It is refusing to agree with what is draining you. It is refusing to repeat what reinforces limitation. It is refusing to normalize what contradicts your calling. It is the quiet but firm decision that says, I will not continue like this. And once that decision becomes stable, your actions begin to follow it. Your words begin to reflect it. Your prayers begin to carry weight, because they are no longer scattered, they are aligned. Now here is something deeper. Breaking patterns is not a single moment. It is a process. There may be moments of strong clarity, but sustaining that clarity matters. Because some structures have been in place for a long time. They were reinforced over years, sometimes decades. So they do not always disappear instantly, but they begin to weaken. The moment you stop reinforcing them, they begin to collapse. The moment you stop agreeing with them, they begin to lose ground. The moment you consistently stand against them. This is why persistence matters. Not emotional burst, but steady alignment. Not occasional intensity, but continuous clarity. Because inconsistency gives patterns space to recover, but consistency gradually removes their foundation. Now consider this. If something has been draining your life, whether it is peace, focus, opportunity, or progress, then part of breaking it is also reclaiming what has been lost. Not just stopping the problem, but restoring what was affected. Because sometimes people focus so much on ending the struggle that they forget to rebuild the strength that was weakened. They forget to restore discipline, to rebuild confidence, to realign habits, to guard what has been regained. And without that, even after a breakthrough, the person may still feel unstable. So true progress has two sides. Breaking what has been working against you, rebuilding what sustains your growth. Both are necessary. Because freedom without structure becomes fragile, and structure without freedom becomes exhausting. But when both come together, something changes deeply. Now there is another layer many overlook: environment. Not just physical environment, but mental and relational environment. If someone is constantly surrounded by voices, ideas, or habits that reinforce limitation, it becomes harder to sustain breakthrough. Because what you consistently hear will influence what you believe, and what you believe will influence how you respond. This is why guarding your environment matters. Not in fear, but in wisdom. Because growth needs the right atmosphere to stabilize. And if that atmosphere is constantly disrupted, progress becomes difficult to maintain. Now, all of this leads to a critical understanding. Breaking patterns is not about one powerful moment. It is about a shift in how you live, how you think, and how you engage spiritually. It is about refusing to go back to unconscious living. It is about staying aware, staying aligned, staying intentional. Because once something has been exposed, you cannot afford to ignore it again. And this is where many breakthroughs are either sustained or lost. Some people experience a shift but return to old patterns of thinking, old language, old passivity, old inconsistency, and slowly what was weakened begins to rebuild. Not because it was stronger, but because it was allowed again. But for someone who decides, I will not go back to that state, everything changes. Because now awareness remains active, alignment remains steady, and resistance no longer finds easy ground. So this is a turning point, not just a moment of intensity, but a decision of consistency. Not just a reaction to pain, but a commitment to transformation. And once that commitment is real, the next phase becomes possible. Because now the believer is not just reacting anymore. They are ready to take control of their spiritual direction. Now something shifts. Up until this point, we have been talking about awareness, patterns, and breaking cycles. But this is where the journey becomes intentional. Because once a person sees clearly and decides not to go back, the next step is not just resistance, it is movement. Forward movement, deliberate movement, non-negotiable movement. Because it is not enough to stop what is wrong, you must begin to establish what is right. Many people focus only on what they are trying to escape. But transformation is not sustained by escape. It is sustained by direction. You must know where you are going, not just what you are living. Because if direction is not clear, the mind will slowly drift back to what is familiar, even if what is familiar was painful. This is why forward movement must be intentional. Not emotional, not occasional, but structured. Now listen carefully. Forward movement in the spirit is not just about activity. It is about alignment with purpose. There are people who are busy but not moving forward. There are people who are active but not advancing. There are people who are trying but not progressing, because movement without alignment leads to exhaustion, not growth. So the question becomes, what does it actually mean to move forward? First, it means you stop allowing your past patterns to define your present decisions. You stop making choices based on fear of repetition. You stop saying, this is how it has always been, so this is how it will be. Because once you accept that, you lock yourself into the same cycle. Forward movement requires a new internal agreement, an agreement that says, my future will not be a copy of my past. And this is not denial, it is redefinition. Second, forward movement requires intentional action. Not just thinking differently, but acting differently. Because change that exists only in thought will not survive in reality. If discipline was missing before, it must now be built. If focus was scattered before, it must now be strengthened. If consistency was weak before, it must now be established. Because breakthrough without structure cannot last, and structure without consistency cannot grow. Third, forward movement requires refusal to be pulled backward. This is critical, because once you begin to move forward, resistance often intensifies, not because you are failing, but because something is losing control. And at that moment, many people misunderstand what is happening. They think the resistance means they are not progressing. But sometimes resistance is proof that progress has started. So the key is not to panic. The key is to remain steady, to refuse to return to old reactions, to refuse to abandon the new direction, because the moment you turn back, the old pattern regains ground. Fourth, forward movement requires protection of progress. Whatever begins to grow must be guarded. Your time must be guarded. Your focus must be guarded. Your energy must be guarded. Your thoughts must be guarded. Because progress is not only built, it is also protected. And anything unprotected becomes vulnerable. Now here is something very important. Forward movement is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is slow. Sometimes it feels like nothing is happening. But consistency is working beneath the surface. Alignment is stabilizing beneath the surface. Strength is building beneath the surface. And over time, what was once difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes habit. What once felt impossible becomes normal. This is how real transformation works. Not in sudden noise, but in sustained change. Now, this leads to a powerful realization. You are not just breaking away from something, you are building into something. A new pattern, a new direction, a new level of stability, a new level of clarity, a new level of authority. And once this begins to form, your life no longer feels like something that is constantly reacting. It becomes something that is intentionally advancing. And this is where identity begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to escape problems. You begin to see yourself as someone moving with purpose, not perfect but progressing, not finished but aligned, not without resistance but no longer controlled by it. And once that identity becomes stable, something powerful happens. Your expectations change. Your decisions change. Your consistency improves. Your confidence becomes grounded not in feelings but in direction. And from that place, forward movement becomes sustainable. Now the final phase becomes clear. If you are moving forward, if you are aligned, if you are consistent, then how do you ensure that what you are building remains strong, protected, and irreversible? Because starting is one thing, continuing is another. But sustaining, that is where true transformation is proven. Now we arrive at one of the most critical stages, because starting something new is powerful. But sustaining it is what proves that real transformation has taken place. Many people have moments, moments of clarity, moments of strength, moments of decision, moments where everything feels like it has shifted. But after the moment, they slowly drift, not intentionally, not suddenly, but gradually. And this is where many breakthroughs are lost, not because they were fake, but because they were not maintained. So the question now is not, can you break free? The question is, can you remain free? Because freedom that is not sustained can quietly reverse, not all at once, but step by step. Old thoughts return, old habits resurface, old reactions begin to creep back in, and before the person realizes it, they are standing close to the same place they once left. This is why maintenance is spiritual discipline, not legalism, not pressure, but awareness plus consistency. Now listen carefully. Sustaining transformation requires intentional reinforcement. Whatever you build must be strengthened daily. If you gain clarity, you must keep feeding that clarity. If you gain discipline, you must keep practicing that discipline. If you gain direction, you must keep walking in that direction. Because anything that is not reinforced will weaken over time. That is not failure, that is reality. Growth requires continuation. Now here is something deeper. Sustaining progress requires guarding your mind, because everything begins there. If your thinking begins to slip back into doubt, negativity, defeat, old expectations, then your actions will slowly follow. And once actions follow, patterns begin to rebuild. This is why not every thought deserves attention. Some thoughts are echoes of your past. Some are reminders of what used to be. Some are suggestions that try to pull you back into old identity, and you must learn to recognize and reject them. Not emotionally, but consciously, because what you entertain consistently will eventually shape your direction. Now, another key: sustaining progress requires consistency over intensity. Many people rely on intensity. They have strong moments, but those moments are not frequent enough. And between those moments, there is too much inconsistency. But real change is not built on intensity. It is built on repetition, daily alignment, daily decisions, daily discipline, because repetition builds structure, and structure sustains progress. Now understand this clearly. You do not need to be perfect, but you must be consistent. You must keep showing up, keep aligning, keep moving forward even when it feels slow. Because slow consistency is stronger than occasional intensity. Now here is something many people overlook. Sustaining transformation requires accountability to truth, not just feelings, because feelings change. Some days you will feel strong, some days you will feel tired, some days you will feel motivated, some days you will not. But if your life is built only on how you feel, it will not be stable. So you must anchor yourself in what is true, truth about who you are becoming, truth about where you are going, truth about what you have decided. And when feelings fluctuate, truth remains. Now, another layer: sustaining progress requires refusal to return. This is a decision, a firm one, because opportunities to go back will come. Old patterns will try to reconnect. Old environments may try to pull you back. Old habits may feel familiar, but you must decide in advance, I am not going back. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Because every time you return, you strengthen what you are trying to live. And every time you refuse, you weaken it. Now, here is a powerful part. As you remain consistent, as you guard your mind, as you reinforce your direction, as you refuse to return, something begins to stabilize deeply within you. You stop feeling like you are fighting all the time. You begin to feel established. What used to be difficult becomes natural. What used to require effort becomes normal. What used to challenge you loses its influence. This is when transformation becomes real, not just visible but stable. And once stability is established, your life no longer feels fragile. It becomes grounded. Now you are not easily shaken, not easily distracted, not easily pulled back, because something inside you has been built and reinforced. And this is where true progress lives. Not in temporary change, but in sustained transformation. Now we move to the final part. Because once something becomes stable, the last question is this: how do you continue to grow without plateauing? How do you move from stability into expansion? Now we reach the final stage. Not just freedom, not just stability, but expansion. Because many people stop too early. They break free and stop. They stabilize and stop. They feel better and stop. But you were not designed just to escape cycles. You were designed to grow beyond them, to expand, to increase, to move into levels that once felt impossible. And this is where the journey becomes intentional again, because growth does not continue automatically. It must be pursued. Now listen carefully. Expansion begins when you refuse to settle at your current level. Even if things are finally working, even if life is now stable, even if the pressure has reduced, you must still ask, what is next? Because comfort can become a new limitation. And if you are not careful, you will trade past struggles for present stagnation. Different problem, same restriction. So expansion requires vision. You must begin to see beyond where you are, not based on fear, but based on possibility. Because what you can see clearly, you can begin to move toward. Now here is something powerful. Expansion requires capacity increase, because you cannot sustain a bigger life with a smaller mindset. You cannot handle greater responsibility with old thinking. You cannot step into higher levels while holding on to limiting beliefs. So growth must happen internally first. Your thinking must stretch. Your expectations must rise. Your discipline must deepen. Your standards must increase. Because expansion is not just about receiving more, it is about becoming capable of managing more. Now understand this clearly. Every new level comes with new demands. More responsibility, more pressure, more decisions, more visibility. And if you are not prepared, what you pray for can overwhelm you. So preparation is not optional, it is necessary. Now here is where many people miss it again. They want expansion but resist growth. They want increase but avoid discipline. They want results but reject structure. And that creates tension. Because expansion and discipline go together, growth and responsibility go together, opportunity and preparation go together. So if you want more, you must become more. Not in identity, but in capacity. Now here is another key. Expansion requires continuous alignment. Because as you grow, new distractions appear, new opportunities, but also new traps. Not everything that looks like progress is actually progress. So discernment must increase. You must learn to say yes to what aligns, no to what distracts. Because growth without direction becomes scattered. And scattered growth leads to hidden stagnation. Now another layer. Expansion requires intentional stretching. You must do things that challenge you. You must step into spaces that require growth. You must take actions that feel uncomfortable but necessary, because comfort maintains, but stretching expands. And every time you stretch, your capacity increases. Now here is something very important. Expansion requires consistency at a higher level. Not just doing more, but doing better consistently, because higher levels demand higher standards. And if your consistency does not increase, your growth will plateau. So you must refine your habits, your focus, your time management, your discipline, because expansion is sustained by systems. Now this leads to a powerful shift in identity. You are no longer trying to survive, trying to escape, trying to fix everything. You are now building, growing, advancing, expanding, and this identity changes everything because you begin to move with purpose, not reacting but leading your own direction, not waiting but creating momentum, not hoping but aligning with action. And from this place, your life begins to reflect a different pattern, a pattern of progress, stability, growth, expansion. Now, here is the final truth. Transformation is not a single event. It is a continuous journey. You break patterns, you build structure, you sustain progress, you expand capacity, and then you repeat the process at a higher level, again and again, because growth never truly ends. And the moment you understand that, you stop looking for one moment that fixes everything. You begin to build a life that continually improves, step by step, level by level, season by season,